In just 7 explosive minutes, J.D. Vance rose from his seat, the weight of a nation on his shoulders, and took the floor of Congress. The room, packed with 435 lawmakers, reporters, cameras, and silent witnesses to history, seemed to freeze as he held up a single folder. Inside it, the proof of a secret deal that would sell out America's workers and hand our industries to foreign powers. His voice rang out, steady but fierce, as he exposed the betrayal that no one wanted to see and left President Biden speechless before the eyes of the world. The chamber was stunned, the air thick with shock, pride, and fear. And as you watch this unfold, ask yourself, if you uncovered a betrayal this big, would you have the courage to speak out? Would you risk everything to defend what's right? Before we dive in, know this. The story you're about to hear is a work of fiction inspired by real emotions, real struggles, and real questions about leadership, loyalty, and courage. No actual events unfolded exactly this way. But the heart of the matter, the fight for truth and dignity, is something every American knows is real. Now let's step into that chamber and witness the moment that shook a nation. Don't look away. This is a story that asks us all, what would we do? It was well past midnight in Washington, but the city wasn't asleep. Not tonight. Outside, the rain came down in sheets, hammering against stone and glass like a warning. Thunder cracked across the sky, loud enough to shake the old bones of the Capitol dome. The streets, slick and empty, reflected the scattered glow of street lamps like molten silver. Inside a narrow row house, light from a single desk lamp cut a pool of gold into the darkness. J.D. Vance sat motionless in his study, his face half-shadowed, the flickering glow of his laptop casting lines of tension across his features. His tie was loosened, his sleeves rolled up, as if he'd been fighting the night itself, and losing. The room was heavy with silence, save for the low hiss of rain against the windows and the occasional creak of the house settling. Framed photos lined the bookshelf, a steel mill, his wife and son on a fishing trip, the flag-draped steps of the Capitol. A small pin, a steel worker's pin, lay near the edge of his desk, catching glints of lightning that flashed across the sky. J.D.'s eyes, sharp with exhaustion, were locked on a single line of text on his screen. Confidential, eyes only. His pulse quickened, each beat loud in his ears. The file had arrived an hour ago, sent from an anonymous address, encrypted, its origin masked so well that even his contacts in cybersecurity couldn't trace it. His fingers hovered over the trackpad. He hesitated, not out of fear, but out of knowing. Some doors, once opened, couldn't be closed. With a steadying breath, J.D. clicked. The file unfolded on the screen. Draft trade agreements, pages and pages of legal language that would have bored most to sleep. But not J.D. Not tonight. He leaned in, the lamp's light catching in his steelworker pin. The documents were clear, chillingly so. Provisions that handed control of America's steel, auto, and energy sectors to foreign interests, cloaked under noble-sounding phrases like strategic partnership and global cooperation. His eyes scanned the signatures, names he recognized, names of senior officials, people who'd sworn to protect the nation's interests. And there, at the bottom of one draft, a signature that made his stomach twist. The president's. Outside, a fresh bolt of lightning split the sky, casting the room in stark white for a heartbeat. J.D. sat frozen, the storm's fury echoing the storm within. He whispered almost to himself, "Is this what they've come to?" His mind raced. How had this reached him? Who was the source? What were they risking? What was he about to risk? On the desk, his phone buzzed once. No name, just a number he didn't know. A second buzz. A text. "You weren't supposed to see that, but you're the only one left who will fight." J.D. stared at the message, the storm pounding harder, as if the city itself was urging him forward. He rose slowly, crossing to the window. The Capitol stood in the distance, its dome a pale ghost in the rain. His reflection stared back at him, weary, determined, and changed. Tonight, the fight wasn't on the Senate floor. It had come to his door, uninvited and undeniable. And J.D. Vance knew one thing with unshakable certainty. The next choice he made would shape the soul of the nation. Would he stay silent, or would he be the voice that called out the betrayal no one wanted to see? And as the storm raged on, he knew the time for silence had passed. The storm outside had not eased. If anything, it felt angrier now, as if the very heavens mirrored the weight of the decision bearing down on J.D. Vance. He stood motionless by the window, his reflection blending with the streaks of rain, the Capitol dome still visible in the distance. A reminder of the duty that had brought him to this point. The documents on his screen haunted him. Each clause felt like a blade aimed at the heart of American industry, each signature a betrayal written in ink. The glow from his laptop pulsed faintly, drawing him back to his desk. He sank into his chair, the storm's rumble filling the room like a drumbeat of consequence. His mind swirled. Expose the truth and risk his career, his family's safety, maybe even his life. Or stay silent, protect his position, and watch the nation's backbone be handed away piece by piece. The weight of that choice pressed down on him harder than the storm ever could. His fingers found the steelworker pin on his desk, turning it over as memory carried him back to Ohio, to a factory floor thick with dust and pride. He could see the faces of men and women who'd built this country's strength with their hands, could hear the clang of hammers and the hiss of steam. He remembered the town hall meeting after the last plant closure, the night he'd stood on a makeshift stage and sworn before them all, "I'll never sell out our people." That promise had brought him to Washington. That promise was the reason he couldn't look away now. The storm roared louder, and JD's resolve began to sharpen. But still, he felt the need for clarity, for counsel from someone who knew what was at stake. He reached for his phone, hesitated, then dialed a number from memory, one he hadn't called in too long. The line crackled before an old voice answered, rough as steel itself. "JD, what's got you calling at this hour?" JD's voice was low, tight with emotion. "They're doing it again, Joe. Selling us out. I have the proof. It's worse than I feared." There was a pause on the other end, the kind that spoke volumes. When Joe finally replied, it was with the quiet strength JD remembered. "Then don't let them." Those 4 words landed heavier than any storm. They carried with them decades of sacrifice, of loyalty to work and country. JD stared at the screen, at the signatures that mocked everything men like Joe had given. The storm's fury seemed to subside, as if waiting for his next move. JD knew there was no middle ground, no safe path that let him keep his promise and his comfort both. His hand closed around the steel pin, and in that grip was his answer. He wasn't just holding a token. He was holding a duty, one he would not abandon. And as dawn threatened the edge of the storm, casting the faintest light over the drenched city, J.D. Vance knew that the next steps he took would either honor his word or break it forever. The weight of Joe's words still echoed in J.D.'s mind as he ended the call, his gaze lingering on the storm-battered city beyond the glass. Then don't let them. It wasn't advice. It was a charge, a reminder of the trust so many had placed in him. J.D. turned back toward his desk, the steelworker pin cool in his hand, grounding him. He stared at the files once more, the treacherous agreements now burned into his memory. The outlines of betrayal were clear, but instinct told him this was just the surface. If he was going to confront this plot, he would need more than a righteous heart. He would need undeniable proof, a plan precise enough to hit its mark, and the courage to see it through. Without another thought, he pulled a yellow legal pad from the drawer, its pages crisp and waiting. The scratch of his pen filled the room, steady and deliberate. Names, dates, connections. He mapped what he knew, what he suspected, and where he'd have to look next. His handwriting grew faster as the picture formed. The hidden meetings, the foreign executives, the officials too quick to sign away what wasn't theirs to give. He jotted down the tools he'd need, cybersecurity experts he could trust, allies in the shadows of government, reporters with integrity left in their bones. The storm outside softened, as if the night itself paused to listen to the sound of resolve taking shape. But the hour dragged on, and fatigue crept in. J.D. leaned back, the plan sketched out in rough form before him, and let his eyes close for just a moment. Sleep, when it came, offered no rest. His mind betrayed him with visions sharper than any dream. Shuttered mills with broken windows staring like empty eyes. Families lined up at food banks under gray skies. Proud hands idle, hollow with the loss of purpose. He saw Joe, younger, standing at a furnace's glow, sweat on his brow, pride in his work. And then he saw it all swept away. By the very signatures on those pages, by the deals forged in secret rooms. He stirred, the storm's hush broken by the quiet tick of the clock. The night had nearly passed. J.D. pushed himself from the chair and moved once more to the window. The rain had eased to a mist, the city glistening under its veil. In the east, the first blush of dawn touched the horizon, pale light bleeding into the sky. And there, framed against the awakening day, stood J.D.'s own reflection. Not the weary man who had opened that file hours ago, but a figure resolved, set against the storm's passing and the battle ahead. The plan was imperfect, the road uncertain, but one truth shone clear. This fight was his, and he would see it through. He stood there for a long moment, watching the Capitol's dome catch the day's first light, feeling the weight of what lay ahead settle on his shoulders. Heavy, but not unwelcome. The storm had done its work. Now it was his turn. The dawn light that had broken the storm offered no comfort. J.D. Vance spent the day in motion, but his mind remained anchored to the plan sketched on that yellow pad, the weight of what he had seen pressing against every breath. The betrayal etched into those documents wasn't some clumsy mistake or passing error. It was deliberate, calculated, and terrifying in scope. By nightfall, the Capitol's grand facade glowed under streetlights, but to J.D. it seemed hollow, its marble walls unable to shield what was unfolding within. That evening, as the city hummed with its usual business of power and pretense, J.D. moved quietly, unseen. His car coasted into a dim, half-abandoned parking garage on the outskirts of town. The structure felt forgotten, like the principles J.D. feared were slipping from the nation's grasp. Shadows stretched long beneath the flickering overhead lights, and every sound, the drip of water, the groan of concrete settling, echoed like a threat. J.D. killed the engine, checked the lot, empty except for a dark sedan tucked deep in the corner. His heart ticked faster, but his steps stayed steady. This was the only way forward. From the shadows a figure emerged, collar turned up, ball cap low. The whistleblower's voice was roughened by nerves but firm with purpose. "You're alone?" J.D. nodded. "You have my word." The man glanced around, then slid a small drive from his coat pocket, pressing it into J.D.'s hand. "This is what they don't want you to find. Recordings, meetings, calls, promises. I shouldn't have them. You shouldn't see them. But if you don't, no one will." J.D.'s fingers closed around the drive like a lifeline. The man's eyes, shadowed but burning with urgency, met his. "Get it out there, before they bury it, before they bury you." Without waiting for thanks, the source melted back into the dark, leaving only the sound of his fading steps and the uneasy silence of the garage. J.D. stood still for a beat, absorbing the enormity of what now rested in his grasp. Later that night, back in the small circle of light cast by his desk lamp, J.D. loaded the drive, his screen filled with files, each named like an unspoken threat. He clicked the first. Voices crackled through his speakers. Voices he recognized. White House officials, their words measured but clear, discussing terms of deals that would see foreign companies control America's steel plants, its auto manufacturing, its energy grids. And then came other voices, accents foreign, polished, promising favorable terms and discreet arrangements. J.D. felt his stomach knot tighter with each word. He'd suspected betrayal. Now he heard it, undeniable, unfiltered. His reflection stared back at him from the screen's dark edges, the steelworker pin resting at the base of his monitor, a silent reminder of what he was fighting for. J.D. exhaled slowly, his mind turning over the reality. This goes deeper than I thought. The storm outside had passed, but a greater storm had begun, one no rain could wash away. J.D. Vance knew, more than ever, that there was no turning back. The truth was in his hands, and with it, the responsibility to act before it was too late. The voices from the recordings lingered long after JD closed his laptop, their sinister promises echoing through his thoughts as if carried by the night itself. Sleep eluded him, and when dawn finally broke again over Washington, the city seemed no brighter for it. The weight of what he knew had carved a hollow space inside him, and that space grew with each passing day as he worked in secret, gathering threads of evidence, piecing together a tapestry of betrayal that few would dare believe. Hours turned into days and JD's world narrowed. Meetings, briefings, hearings, all the routine rhythms of his position became background noise to the storm inside his mind. And somewhere along the way, without meaning to, he began to disappear from his own life. He missed his son's school event, a simple thing, a science fair JD had promised he wouldn't miss. His wife had reminded him that morning, her hand resting gently on his arm, eyes searching his for some trace of the man she'd married. He had nodded, distracted, consumed by the plan forming in his head, the details of who to trust, how to time the confrontation. The hours slipped past, the school gym emptied, and the disappointed silence on his wife's face that evening spoke louder than any argument could have. Friends called, some to check in, others to invite him for a quiet dinner, a chance to breathe. He let the calls go to voicemail, telling himself he'd return them tomorrow. Tomorrow became the next day. The next day became never. The isolation wasn't forced upon him. It was the price he chose to pay, whether he admitted it or not. One night, as the city slept and the Capitol dome glowed like a beacon he could no longer trust, JD found himself standing in his study, the soft light of his desk lamp casting long shadows across the room. His gaze drifted to the shelf where family photos stood, moments frozen in time before the storm began. His son's wide grin as he held up a freshly caught fish, his wife's laugh, caught mid-motion on a breezy autumn day. JD's own face, younger, unburdened, full of promise. The sight of those photos cracked something inside him. He sank into his chair, staring at them, feeling the full weight of what lay ahead settle on his chest like stone. Was this what it took to do the right thing? To stand alone in the dark, hoping the light would still be waiting on the other side? The pad of paper from nights before still lay on his desk, its edges curled from constant use. JD reached for it, took up his pen, and began to write. The words came slowly at first, then with growing force, as if by writing them he could steady his soul. America is not for sale. The sentence stared back at him, stark and certain. He wrote it again beneath the first line, and again, until the page bore the imprint of his resolve as deeply as it bore the ink. Outside, the city exhaled in the hush before dawn, and inside, JD Vance sat in that quiet, knowing the path he was on would cost him dearly, but knowing, too, that some sacrifices were worth making. The quiet before dawn that filled JD's study that night didn't last. As morning broke, Washington stirred with new energy, the kind that masked danger behind a polished smile. News leaked in careful whispers. The White House would soon announce what it called a historic trade agreement, one said to signal a new era of American prosperity. The phrase rang hollow to JD. He knew the truth buried beneath those words, and as the day unfolded, he saw how easily that truth could be drowned out by spectacle. Across the city, banners unfurled, headlines praised, and commentators speculated with excitement. JD watched it all, his face unreadable, his thoughts far from the polished screens and the glowing praise. He moved through the halls of power like a man out of place, each handshake and pleasantry another reminder of the deception he was preparing to expose. That evening, while the city's elite gathered beneath chandeliers and string quartets at a gala celebrating the coming announcement, JD stood apart. The grand ballroom shimmered with crystal and gold, voices mingling in practiced laughter, the clink of glasses filling the air with hollow music. JD watched from the edge of the room, his formal attire doing little to mask how removed he felt. Around him, the powerful and the comfortable toasted to the promise of progress, blind to the cost it would demand of those far from this room's warmth. He caught snippets of conversation, praise for the administration's bold vision, admiration for the courage to engage globally, as one senator put it. Another, holding a glass of expensive champagne, spoke with pride of how history would remember this deal. JD's hands tightened into fists at his sides. Unseen beneath the linen tablecloth, he gripped for steadiness. The words felt like ash in his ears, knowing what he knew. His eyes drifted to the windows of the ballroom. Beyond the glass, the city glowed beneath its lights, but to JD it seemed shadowed, hollowed out. Somewhere beyond those lights were the factories that would stand silent if this agreement passed. The workers who would be left behind while toasts were raised in their name. He stepped outside, unable to bear the charade a moment longer. The night air was cool against his face, a stark contrast to the stifling warmth inside. He stood on the grand balcony overlooking the city, the Capitol dome bright against the dark sky, a beacon that felt, in this moment, as distant as the stars above it. "They don't see the storm coming," JD murmured, the words carried off by the breeze. He thought of the storm that had broken over the city days before, of the documents now hidden in his home, of the recordings that still echoed in his ears. A storm was coming, one no gala, no polished speech could hold at bay, and JD knew he would be the one to bring it. The murmur of celebration continued behind him, but JD stayed where he was, letting the night steal his resolve. Soon the cameras would turn to Congress. Soon the president would stand before the nation. And soon JD Vance would have to choose his moment to make the truth heard, no matter the cost. The night of the gala faded into memory, but the unease JD Vance carried from that balcony remained, sharper than ever as the day of the announcement dawned. The city hummed with expectation, its streets busier than usual, security tight, news vans parked like sentinels along the avenues leading to the Capitol. This was to be no ordinary address. This was history, as the papers had declared, the crowning moment of an administration that promised bold vision and global leadership. But for JD, it felt like the prelude to disaster, one gilded in ceremony to hide its cost. Inside the Capitol, the air vibrated with anticipation. Members of Congress filed into the chamber, their conversations a low rumble beneath the towering marble columns. The great space was dressed for spectacle. Flags draped the walls, their stars and stripes catching the warm glow of the chandeliers. High above, the carved ceiling seemed to press down, as if the weight of history itself bore witness to what was about to unfold. The media cameras rolled, their lenses sweeping the room, capturing the polished smiles, the firm handshakes, the subtle jockeying for position. The gallery was packed. Dignitaries, diplomats, special guests, all eager to see the moment their hosts had promised would define a new chapter for America. JD sat in his place, shoulders squared, but heart pounding beneath his suit. From where he sat, he could see it all. The raised platform where the president would soon stand, the vice president's chair behind it, the sea of faces turned expectantly toward that focal point. His gaze swept the room, seeing the excitement in some eyes, the indifference in others, but little of the wariness he felt burning inside. He flexed his fingers against the armrest, grounding himself. This chamber, so grand in its design, felt suddenly small, as if the walls might close in with the weight of the truth he carried. And then came the sound that silenced the hum of conversation, the announcement that the president was arriving. The doors opened at the rear of the chamber, and the room rose as one. Applause filled the space, loud and sustained, echoing from the marble like thunder in a storm. JD's breath caught as Biden entered, flanked by aides, his expression composed, measured, the practiced confidence of a man who had walked this path many times before. The president nodded to familiar faces, offered a wave to the gallery, and mounted the steps to the podium, each movement slow, deliberate, heavy with the promise of the words to come. JD stayed standing as protocol demanded, but inside tension crackled like dry wood near flame. The applause rolled on, a sound that seemed to JD both deafening and hollow. He forced himself to breathe, to observe, to remember that this moment, this carefully crafted illusion of unity and progress, was the stage on which he would have to act. The cameras caught it all, the banners, the marble, the faces of power arrayed in their finery. But what they could not see, what only JD felt, was the storm gathering beneath the surface, ready to break. As the clapping began to fade and the president unfolded his notes, JD's gaze fixed on the flag that draped the wall behind the podium. It seemed to him more than fabric. It was the promise he had sworn to defend, the promise they were poised to betray. The chamber settled into expectant silence, the hum of anticipation now a steady drumbeat in JD's ears. And in that charged quiet he felt it. The stage was set, the storm was coming, and soon his moment would arrive. The chamber held its breath as the president placed his notes on the podium, his gaze sweeping the room with practiced ease. For a heartbeat there was silence, the kind that marks a turning point, a pause before words that will either heal or divide. Then, in a voice measured and confident, Biden began to speak. His tone carried the weight of experience, his phrasing polished by countless addresses, but to J.D. Vance every syllable rang hollow, every promise a carefully wrapped deception. Biden spoke of a new dawn for American prosperity, of bold leadership that would restore our standing in the world. He painted the trade deal as the solution to hardships faced by working families, as the answer to economic uncertainty. But beneath the soaring rhetoric, J.D. heard it for what it was, the language of surrender, dressed up as salvation. The president spoke of global cooperation, of mutual benefit, of hard choices in hard times. And with each phrase, J.D. felt his pulse quicken, the steelworker's pin on his lapel suddenly heavy under his fingers. And then came the part that made J.D.'s jaw tighten, his hands clenched beneath the table where no camera could see. Biden shifted the narrative, laying the groundwork for blame. He spoke of the wreckage left behind by the previous administration, of policies rooted in isolation rather than progress, of the damage done by short-sighted nationalism. The words were crafted to deflect, to rewrite history in the service of a deal that would hand the nation's industrial soul to foreign powers. The chamber absorbed it all, many nodding along, some even smiling as if reassured by the familiarity of the argument. J.D. felt the weight of the moment press harder against him. His thumb traced the edge of the pin, its cool metal a small anchor in the rising tide of frustration. He thought of the mills, the factories, the communities he had promised to protect, the places that had suffered not from isolation, but from leaders who had treated their lives as bargaining chips. The speech built toward its crescendo, each sentence crafted to inspire applause, to give the illusion of unity and purpose. And when Biden finally declared that this agreement would secure a future for every American family and ensure our industries thrive in a modern, interconnected world, the chamber responded on cue. The room rose in thunderous approval, cheers rolling like a wave across the marble and wood. Cameras panned the faces of lawmakers clapping, of dignitaries beaming, of a president standing tall at the podium, soaking in the adulation. But J.D. did not rise. He remained seated, hands tight around the armrests, jaw clenched, heart pounding, so loud in his ears he could barely hear the applause. His eyes stayed fixed on the flag behind the podium, its folds catching the warm light, a reminder of the promise that flag represented, a promise he saw slipping away with every hollow cheer. He let the noise wash over him, felt its emptiness, its pretense. And in that moment, J.D. Vance knew two things with absolute clarity. The truth had no place in that room today, and it would fall to him, and him alone, to speak it. The storm was not coming. It was here, and soon he would have to rise against it. The applause still echoed through the chamber, the sound bouncing off marble columns and carved wood, filling the vast space with a hollow triumph. J.D. Vance sat unmoving, his pulse a steady drum in his ears. His hands clenched tighter now around the steel pin on his lapel. The cheers had faded into polite murmurs, the kind that signaled the end of a speech and the return to business as usual. But J.D. knew nothing after this moment would be usual again. His eyes scanned the chamber, finding the faces of those few he still trusted, allies who understood the stakes, who had seen the shadows in the bright words that had just been spoken. A quiet exchange of glances was all it took. A nod from one, a brief tightening of the jaw from another. Silent signals passed between them like sparks before a flame. J.D.'s breath slowed. The plan he'd mapped out on that yellow pad in the dead of night was no longer lines of ink. It was real, and its time had come. His hand slipped beneath the desk, fingers brushing the edge of the thick folder that lay hidden there, filled with the evidence no one in this chamber wanted to face. His heart pounded louder now. but his grip was steady. He rose. The simple act seemed to ripple through the room. Conversations halted mid-sentence. Heads turned, some with surprise, others with suspicion. The cameras that had begun to power down after the president's speech flicked back on, operators sensing something. They didn't know what, but they knew enough to focus. JD held the folder close, its weight as real as the burden he carried. His voice, when it came, was calm but firm, cutting through the sudden hush that had fallen like a heavy curtain. The air in the chamber seemed to shift, charged now with something electric, something unseen but undeniable. JD could feel it, the shift from ceremony to consequence, from show to substance. He stepped into the open space between the rows of seats, every eye now fixed on him, every breath in the room held as if history itself had paused to listen. The flag behind the podium stirred gently in the breeze of the cooling systems, its stars and stripes a silent witness to what was about to unfold. JD didn't rush. Every movement was deliberate, each step measured. He felt the weight of generations behind him. The workers, the builders, the communities who had trusted him to fight for them. His thumb brushed the steelworker's pin one last time before he laid the folder down on his desk, opened it, and lifted out the first page. The chamber remained frozen, the tension thick enough to feel in the air, as if the room itself braced for what was coming. And in that stillness, JD knew. The fuse had been lit. There would be no turning back. What he was about to reveal would change the course of this day, this Congress, perhaps this nation. The silence deepened, the kind of silence that comes before a storm. J.D. Vance stood at its center, ready to speak the words that would shatter it. The chamber seemed to hold its breath as J.D. Vance stood tall, the thick folder in his hand, his gaze steady beneath the weight of 1,000 stares. For a fleeting moment, the silence felt absolute, a stillness so complete that J.D. could hear the faint hum of the overhead lights, the subtle creak of chairs as lawmakers shifted in their seats, the distant click of a camera lens refocusing. Then, with the calm clarity of a man who had rehearsed this moment in his mind 100 sleepless nights, J.D.'s voice rose, cutting through the hush like a blade. "Mr. President," he began, his words ringing across the chamber, "let's show them the real plan." A murmur rippled through the hall, surprise flashing across faces both familiar and hostile. The president's head turned slowly, expression unreadable, as JD opened the folder with deliberate care, lifting out the first page. His hands didn't tremble. The years of fighting for those without a voice had led to this. He wouldn't falter now. JD read aloud, his tone unwavering, as he spoke the language of betrayal disguised in legal phrases. He recited the clauses that ceded control of American steel mills, that offered automotive plants as bargaining chips, that gave foreign energy giants quiet authority over grids built by generations of American hands. Each word echoed in the chamber, stripping away the illusion crafted moments before in the president's polished address. JD held the signed pages high enough for cameras and colleagues alike to see. The inked names of officials entrusted to protect the nation's interest, and at the bottom, the signature that made the betrayal undeniable. The room shifted from stunned silence to a growing rumble of disbelief. JD wasn't done. With measured precision, he took out his phone, tapping it to play a short recording through its small but powerful speaker. The crackling audio filled the chamber, voices of senior officials discussing terms in quiet tones, foreign executives offering favorable arrangements in discreet handling. Promises made behind closed doors now laid bare before the nation. The reaction was swift, explosive. Gasps filled the chamber, followed by shouts. Some of outrage, others of denial, still others of confusion as lawmakers scrambled to process what they were hearing and seeing. A few stood, demanding order, voices raised above the rising din. Reporters in the gallery leaned forward, fingers flying over keyboards, cameras zooming to catch every angle, every flicker of emotion on faces suddenly laid bare. The president remained still at the podium, his expression tightening, eyes fixed on JD. The applause and unity that had filled the room minutes before had been swept away in a tide of chaos and reckoning. JD lowered the page, the phone's recording ending in a final crackle that seemed to leave the chamber hollowed out in its wake. He looked out across the room, at allies who nodded in grim support, at opponents who glared or looked away, at the flag that stood as silent witness above it all. The storm he had felt building had broken at last. The chamber had become its eye. And in that charged moment, J.D. Vance knew the unmasking was complete. What came next would test not only him, but the very soul of the body before him. The chamber vibrated with the force of J.D.'s revelation. The recording's last crackle still hanging in the air, like the echo of a lightning strike. For a long heartbeat, no one moved, as if the room itself had been struck dumb by the weight of what had just been laid bare. But the storm J.D. had unleashed could not be held in silence. It began, first with hurried whispers, then with rising voices as lawmakers scrambled to react. Biden's team moved quickly, some stepping forward as if to physically interject, others raising their voices in protest. A senior aide, face flushed with alarm, called for the speaker to intervene. Another advisor tried to redirect attention, gesturing toward security as if the mere presence of orderlies could undo what had been done. But J.D. was already beyond reach. His voice, steady at first, rose now with the force of a man unwilling to be silenced. "You blame Trump," J.D. called out, his words slicing through the noise like a bell in fog. "But it's your pen that betrays us." The chamber erupted anew. Some lawmakers shouted him down, demanding order, their voices ragged with anger or fear. Others, caught in the truth's unflinching glare, found themselves frozen or murmuring support, the moral line drawn too clearly to ignore. J.D. saw faces turn red with fury, eyes narrowed with contempt. But he also saw heads nod, fists clenched at sides, hearts stirred awake by what had been hidden now revealed. The speaker banged the gavel, the sharp crack barely audible above the din. "Order! This chamber will come to order!" But the gavel might as well have been a pebble tossed into a raging river. The current of the moment swept beyond such gestures, the tide of revelation and fury too strong to stem. J.D. stood at its center, unshaken. The steelworker's pin on his lapel caught the bright eye of a camera's zoom, the small emblem glinting beneath the chamber's lights. The image broadcast live, that tiny piece of metal became more than jewelry. It became a symbol of the workers J.D. spoke for, of the industries sold off behind closed doors, of communities forgotten in the polished phrases of speeches. Across the country, families watching saw it, a simple reminder of the dignity that built their nation. J.D.'s voice did not falter. He lifted the signed pages again, letting the cameras catch them, the names inked in black that history would now judge. "These are not the marks of leadership," he said, voice resonant above the clamor. "These are the marks of surrender." The president remained at the podium, hands gripping its edge, his composure strained. For a fleeting second, their eyes met across the chamber. J.D.'s burning with conviction, Biden's clouded with something harder to read. Anger, disbelief, perhaps regret. The room seemed caught between collapse and clarity, its members divided not by party, but by conscience. Some shouted for J.D. to yield. Others urged him on with voices that grew stronger, emboldened by the storm he had dared to start. The gavel fell again, louder this time, the speaker's voice desperate to restore control. But J.D. knew the truth. Control had already shifted. The chamber, the nation, the story. None would return to what they had been before this moment. The fire had been lit, and its fury would not be contained. The chamber seethed with noise, a tempest of voices rising and clashing as J.D.'s words echoed across the marble walls. The gavel's cracks rang out again and again, but they could not bring order. The truth had been dragged into the light, and no amount of ritual could shove it back into the shadows. J.D. stood steady at the storm's eye, heart pounding but voice unshaken, pages of betrayal still raised for all to see. And then, as if the air itself had shifted, a figure rose from the front bench. A senior White House aide, one of the president's closest advisors, known for his discretion, his loyalty, his mastery of navigating crisis without a word out of place. But tonight his face was pale, his eyes heavy, as if the weight of what had been exposed pressed down on him too. He cleared his throat, and against the roar of the chamber, his voice carried with quiet force. "Yes," the aide said, his gaze sweeping the room but finally resting on the president. "There were talks." The words hit like a hammer blow. The chamber froze. The fury silenced as suddenly as it had erupted. The air grew thick, every ear straining to hear what would follow. "Under pressure, we lost our way," the aide continued, the admission stark against the grand promises that had filled the room minutes before. What began as a search for solutions became something else. We thought we could control it. We thought no one would see. JD's breath caught, but he didn't move, his eyes locked now on Biden. The president's face was still, but his knuckles whitened against the podium's edge, his jaw set tight. Around him, lawmakers sat rigid, as if afraid even to shift, lest they disturb the fragile moment that had descended on the chamber. The aide's voice softened. "We forgot who we serve." And with that, he sank back into his seat, the storm he had braved now behind him, leaving the chamber suspended in a silence that felt deeper than any sound. JD let the stillness settle, let its weight press on every soul in the room. His grip eased on the pages in his hands. He lowered them slowly, deliberately, laying them on his desk as if setting down a burden he had carried too long. His gaze remained fixed on the president, unwavering, steady, and when he spoke again, his voice was not loud, but it filled the chamber all the same, every word clear as a bell in the night. "The people deserve the truth," JD said, his tone carrying not anger now but something stronger. Resolve, the quiet steel of a man who had done what duty demanded. And their jobs. No more was needed. The chamber remained hushed, the storm spent but its mark left on all who had witnessed it. JD stood in that moment, knowing the break had come, that nothing could go back to what it was. And as he slowly returned to his seat, the flag behind the podium seemed to hang a little heavier, as if it too bore the weight of what had been laid bare. The chamber's silence, so heavy in that final moment, did not last. By the time J.D. Vance stepped away from his desk, by the time the stunned lawmakers filed out of the Capitol into the waiting night, the storm that had erupted within those walls had already begun to spread across the nation. Screens in newsrooms, bars, homes, and factories flickered with breaking news banners. Live replays of the confrontation rolling again and again. Anchors spoke in tones of shock and urgency, voices barely keeping pace with the images that gripped the country. JD's words, "The people deserve the truth," and their jobs, echoed through televisions and radios, through social feeds and front pages. Americans watched, many in disbelief, as the president's polished speech crumbled beneath the weight of the revelations JD had laid bare. The recordings, the signed pages, the aide's quiet confession, all of it replayed in endless loops, every detail scrutinized, every expression analyzed. In living rooms and break rooms, families and co-workers gathered, drawn together by the gravity of what they had witnessed. Some wept openly, tears of vindication, of anger, of relief that at last someone had stood up and spoken the words they had longed to hear. Others cheered, pounding fists on tables, raising glasses in toasts not just to J.D. Vance, but to the hope that the betrayal they'd suspected in their bones had finally been called out for all to see. At factories across the country, places where the machines had grown too quiet, where layoffs had thinned shifts and darkened floors, workers gathered in impromptu meetings. In parking lots and union halls, they watched replays on phones propped up on toolboxes, on break room TVs brought out and plugged into extension cords. They listened, faces lined with hard years and harder choices, as JD's voice rose above the noise of politics as usual. Outside steel mills and auto plants, rallies sparked like brush fires. Flags waved, hand-lettered signs appeared. "Our jobs matter." "Thank you, JD. No more sellouts." The air filled with chants that echoed across empty lots and long-idled assembly lines. Voices joined not by party, but by purpose. The headlines the next morning said it plainly. J.D. Vance, the man who wouldn't let them sell us out. His face filled front pages, news sites, the lead image on evening broadcasts. In a single night, he had become more than a lawmaker. He had become a symbol of defiance against betrayal, of the power of one voice to challenge the tide. But JD himself, watching from a quiet office as the coverage rolled on, felt no triumph. He saw not his own image, but the faces of those who had waited too long for someone to stand for them. The families, the workers, the communities whose future now hung in the balance. He knew this was no victory, not yet. The battle had only begun, and the forces arrayed against him would not yield easily. Yet as dawn broke over a nation still reeling, one thing was certain. The truth had found its voice. And across America, people who had felt forgotten found reason to hope that this time, that voice would not be silenced. The sun had barely risen on the day after J.D. Vance's stand when the tide began to turn against him. What the night had brought in admiration and hope, the morning delivered in backlash. The same screens that replayed his words and actions now filled with voices questioning his motives, his integrity, even his sanity. Commentators who had praised his courage hours before shifted their tone, some calling him reckless, others painting him as a man driven by ambition rather than duty. The headlines that had named him the man who wouldn't let them sell us out were soon joined by others more venomous. Vance's stunt threatens national stability. Loose cannon or savior? Is J.D. Vance undermining American unity? The machine J.D. had challenged was vast, and it had no intention of surrendering without a fight. And with the smear came the shadows. J.D.'s phone rang at strange hours, numbers he didn't recognize delivering threats masked as warnings. Messages arrived, some veiled, others blunt, hinting at consequences if he didn't reconsider, if he didn't step back before real harm was done. He ignored them at first, but then the unease grew harder to dismiss. A dark SUV parked too long outside his home. Faces he didn't know lingered too near his family when they went out for groceries or to school. The decision was not hard, though it broke his heart. J.D. moved his family to a safe location, somewhere quiet, away from the cameras, the headlines, the danger that now seemed to follow him like a shadow. His nights became a blur of sleepless hours, eyes burning from too little rest, mind racing with what had been set in motion. He watched the news, read the editorials, saw how quickly the truth could be twisted when power felt threatened. Allies who had cheered him in the chamber just days before now urged caution. Some called for private meetings, their voices low, their words heavy with worry. "You've made your point, J.D.," one said, eyes darting as if the walls themselves might listen. "Step back now. Let this cool down." Another pleaded, "There's a way to save face without burning the whole house down. Think of your career, your family." But J.D. Vance did not waver. The image of those signed pages, the sound of those recordings, the memory of faces in factory yards and union halls, all of it left him no room to retreat. The price of truth was high, higher than he'd imagined. But he had already paid it in sleepless nights, in the fear he saw in his wife's eyes, in the distance he'd placed between himself and those he loved to keep them safe. To back down now would mean that price had been for nothing. And that, J.D. knew, was a cost he could never justify. The fight had come to him, and he would see it through no matter how steep the toll. The storm J.D. Vance had unleashed did not end with threats or headlines. Outside the walls of power, across factory towns, small cities, and rural stretches of the nation, the voices of ordinary Americans began to rise. Not in anger at J.D., but in support, in shared outrage, in calls for justice. The petition started as sparks. A union local in Pennsylvania demanding a congressional inquiry, a community group in Michigan organizing an online drive, a coalition of small business owners in Ohio posting open letters. But within days, the sparks became ablaze. Congress was flooded with letters, emails, calls, and signatures. Tens of thousands, then hundreds of thousands, then more. The message was clear and relentless. We demand the truth. We demand action. We demand accountability. The machinery of government, so often slow to respond, found itself unable to ignore the swell. What had begun as one man's stand now echoed with the weight of a nation stirred awake. J.D. watched it unfold from his quiet office, Sleepless nights leaving lines beneath his eyes but fire in his spirit. The smears had not silenced the people. The threats had not cowed them. The storm that had begun in that chamber had broken beyond Washington, and JD knew he had to meet it, not just with defiance, but with a plan. He pulled out the same yellow legal pad where, in the lonely hours of a storm-torn night, he had first mapped his course. And there, in crisp, determined strokes, he began to draft what he would soon call the Fair Trade First Bill. It was more than legislation. It was a promise on paper to safeguard American jobs, to block deals that sold out the nation's industries, to demand transparency in every negotiation that bore the people's name. Clause by clause, line by line, JD shaped it, the hum of his desk lamp the only sound in the room as dawn crept toward the Capitol dome. And then, one by one, came the calls. At first they were cautious. Voices that had once dismissed him as reckless now edged with curiosity, with grudging respect, with a hint of hope. A senator from a manufacturing state, long silent on trade, left a message. "I want to talk." A representative who had been quick to condemn JD's outburst now asked, "Is there room in this bill for bipartisan input?" Even a longtime critic from across the aisle reached out quietly. "Let's discuss what's possible." JD listened, not with triumph, but with the sober understanding of what was at stake. The tide was shifting, but tides could change again. This moment would not last unless he turned the swell of public will into something real, something lasting. The fight was far from over. But for the first time since that stormy night, when the truth had landed in his inbox like a spark in dry grass, JD Vance felt the wind begin to move at his back. The calls from colleagues, the petitions flooding Congress, the shift in public voice, they were only the beginning. JD Vance knew that if he wanted real change, if he wanted to turn the rising tide into lasting reform, he had to leave the marble halls of Washington behind for a time. The fight wasn't on the floor of the Capitol anymore. It was in the towns where the promises had been broken, in the communities that had been forgotten while deals were made in quiet rooms. And so JD hit the road. He traveled with no cameras, no entourage, no polished speechwriters in tow, only a small team to handle logistics and security, and the steelworker's pin on his lapel as constant companion. The towns welcomed him not with banners or parades, but with cautious hope, with handshakes that spoke of calloused palms and weary hearts, with faces lined by years of worry and waiting. He stood before boarded-up plants, their windows cracked or covered with plywood. The names of companies once spoken with pride, now faded and flaking on rust-streaked walls. Flags still flew at these sites, though their colors had dulled, the fabric worn thin by wind and time. Some hung from rusting poles that leaned slightly now, as if weighed down by the very history they marked. JD walked those grounds slowly, boots crunching over gravel, listening more than he spoke, letting the silence of these places fill him with the reminder of what was at stake. In union halls and school gymnasiums, at picnic tables set up in parking lots, the workers gathered, those still employed and those long since laid off, those who'd stayed and those who'd returned for this moment, drawn by the possibility that someone might finally be fighting for them. JD spoke plainly, without flourish, without promises he couldn't keep. He told them of the bill he was drafting, of the battle ahead in Congress, of the truth they already knew in their bones, that saving American jobs wasn't about speeches or slogans, but about standing firm against those who would trade away the nation's strength for a seat at some global table. And time after time, when the meetings ended, when hands had been shaken and the last question asked, someone would remain behind, waiting for a quiet word, a private thank you. In a town in western Pennsylvania, it was a man in his 60s, oil-stained ball cap in hand, who said, "You gave us hope, sir. That's more than we've had in a long while." In Ohio, a young woman, her father's old factory badge hanging from a chain around her neck, said simply, "Please don't stop." In Michigan, an older couple who'd driven 2 hours just to hear him speak pressed his hand in theirs and said, "You made us feel seen again." JD carried their words with him from town to town, each one a stone added to the foundation he was trying to build. And as he looked out at the faces that filled folding chairs in school gyms and union halls, he saw not just voters or constituents, but the soul of the nation he had sworn to serve. The road stretched long ahead, but JD knew now, more than ever, that the fight was worth every mile. The miles JD Vance had logged across the battered towns of the heartland left him exhausted, but they also left him resolved. He had seen too much: the boarded windows, the rusted gates, the tired but determined eyes of men and women who had given their lives to building a nation that now seemed ready to forget them. And so, when he returned to Washington, he knew that speeches whispered in back rooms or buried in committees would not be enough. The country needed to hear, unfiltered, what he had seen, what he had learned, and what he was prepared to do. He arranged a live address. No grand hall, no ornate backdrop. JD stood at a simple podium in a room stripped of pretense, the flag behind him, his steelworker's pin catching the studio lights just enough to glint like a promise. The networks at first hesitated. Some questioned whether the moment had passed, whether the noise of politics as usual had drowned out what JD had sparked. But as word spread that he would speak directly to the people, not in sound bites, not in talking points, the cameras turned on and the nation tuned in. JD began softly, the weight of his travels still in his voice. He spoke of the workers he had met, of the towns he had walked, of the promises made and broken. He named no names, made no cheap shots, but every word struck home. And then, as his voice rose with the fire that had carried him through sleepless nights, he delivered the line that would be replayed across the country, across the world. "We don't sell out, we stand up." The phrase wasn't written by speechwriters or polished in focus groups. It was the truth as JD had lived it, as the people he fought for had lived it. And as the words rang out, across living rooms and factory floors, across crowded bars and quiet kitchens, families listened, together. In a modest home in Youngstown, a mother wiped a tear from her cheek as her teenage son watched wide-eyed. In a small apartment in Detroit, an elderly couple sat hand in hand, nodding along as if JD's words had reached across the miles to speak directly to them. In diners, on military bases, in union halls, people leaned closer to the screens. The noise of daily life paused, if only for those few moments. The networks hadn't planned for it, but as the ratings surged, as viewers called and messaged and posted, demanding to hear more, they couldn't look away. What had begun as a broadcast slotted between scheduled programming became the lead story. Analysts tried to capture what was happening, but the truth was simple. JD's words had lit a fire that no spin could smother. When the address ended, JD stepped back from the podium, not with triumph, but with the quiet certainty of a man who had spoken his heart. He didn't wait for applause or commentary. He left the studio as he had entered, with purpose, with resolve, and with the knowledge that the fight was far from over. But now he was not fighting alone. The night of JD Vance's address had ended without fanfare. There was no victory parade, no grand celebration, no instant legislative win. But in the quiet hours that followed, something far more powerful began to stir. JD returned to his office long after the cameras had gone dark, the weight of his words still heavy in his chest. He expected the usual flood of noise, critics eager to twist his message, allies cautious to stand too close. But what he found instead was the sound of phones ringing, not with threats or warnings this time, but with quiet invitations. They came first in ones and twos, lawmakers who had kept their distance during the storm, now reaching out behind closed doors. A senator from the Midwest, a Republican known for his careful, calculated moves, asked for a private meeting. "I've read your draft, JD," he said, voice low, "and I think we can make this work." Hours later, a Democrat from a coastal district, long skeptical of trade reforms, knocked on JD's office door unannounced. "I don't agree with you on everything," she said, "but I can't argue with what you're fighting for." Soon more followed. Conversations that once would have been impossible now unfolded in quiet corners of Capitol offices, in late-night calls, in unrecorded gatherings where titles and party lines mattered less than the shared urgency of the moment. They weren't ready to say so publicly, not yet, but they were ready to listen, to help shape the Fair Trade First bill into something they could stand behind. JD sensed it in the tone of their voices, in the way they leaned in when they spoke, in the way they asked not if this could succeed, but how. Outside those meetings, the media tide began to shift. The same outlets that had once questioned his judgment now ran segments titled J.D. Vance, Defender of Main Street. Editorials spoke of his courage, his refusal to back down in the face of overwhelming pressure. Reporters who had once framed him as reckless now praised his clarity of purpose, his connection to the people who felt left behind. Polls reflected it too. JD's approval numbers climbing, the public hunger for accountability and fair trade louder than it had been in years. JD watched the momentum build not with satisfaction, but with a cautious hope. He knew how fleeting such tides could be, how quickly the winds of politics could shift again. But for the first time since that stormy night when betrayal had landed in his inbox like a spark, he felt the weight begin to share itself across broader shoulders. The fight was still his, but now at last others were stepping forward to stand beside him. The Capitol, so often a fortress of inertia, felt different in those days. There was a current running through its halls, a sense that change was possible, that the voices JD had heard in factory lots and union halls were finally, truly being carried into the heart of power. And as he left another late-night meeting with a bipartisan group of lawmakers, JD paused beneath the shadow of the dome, the flag above him stirring in the night breeze. He let the moment settle over him, let himself feel the shift, however slight. The battle was far from over, but the coalition was forming, and for the first time, he could see a path forward through the storm. The weeks that followed J.D. Vance's fiery stand had been a storm of negotiations, committee meetings, and public hearings. The Capitol, so long resistant to change, had bent, slowly at first, then with growing momentum as the voices of the people grew too loud to ignore. What had begun as a single voice calling out in a chamber thick with denial had swelled into a chorus that reached every corner of the nation. Now at last the moment had come when all those voices, all those battles, would find their answer. The Grand Hall of Congress was packed, not just with lawmakers, but with citizens who had traveled from steel towns, auto communities, and energy hubs to bear witness. The air crackled with anticipation, heavy with history. J.D. Vance sat quietly in the gallery above the floor, removed from the debate but not from the weight of what was unfolding. His heart pounded as speeches were made, some in praise of the new bipartisan bill that had emerged from the wreckage of the trade deal, others grudging in their acceptance that the tide had turned. The Fair Trade First bill, a law designed to prioritize American workers, demand transparency in trade negotiations, and prevent the kind of quiet betrayal that had nearly passed unnoticed, now stood on the brink of passage. The trade deal that had threatened the nation's industrial soul was halted, formally withdrawn after weeks of public scrutiny and political pressure that no one could have imagined on that stormy night when JD first opened the encrypted file that changed everything. From his seat above, JD watched it all. The final debate, the roll call vote, the moment when the tally on the board made clear that the bill would pass. Not by a slim margin, but with a force that spoke of unity found in shared purpose. The chamber erupted in applause, genuine and full-throated, a sound that reverberated off marble walls and wooden benches, that filled the space not with empty noise, but with relief, with pride, with the sense that something right had been done at last. JD felt his throat tighten, his breath catch. His hand moved instinctively to the steelworker's pin on his lapel, fingers closing around it like an anchor. The small piece of metal, so simple, so unassuming, had been with him through every mile, every sleepless night, every hard decision. Now it felt heavier than ever, not with burden, but with meaning. His eyes glistened as he looked down at the floor of the chamber, at the lawmakers who had found the courage to stand together, at the staffers and citizens who had filled the galleries and watched from afar. He thought of the workers who would see the plants stay open, the families who could face the future with renewed hope. He thought of Joe, the old steel worker whose quiet words on that fateful night had lit the fire in his heart. Then don't let them. And in that moment, J.D. Vance knew that whatever battles lay ahead, whatever storms still waited on the horizon. This was a victory worth every sacrifice. He stayed seated as the applause rolled on, his hands still on the pin, his gaze steady on the flag that draped the chamber wall. A flag that on this day flew not just for power, but for the people it was meant to serve. The applause had long faded, the chamber emptied, and the Capitol settled back into its familiar quiet. But for J.D. Vance, sleep did not come. The night had been spent in thought, in quiet conversations with allies, in moments staring out at the city lights, letting the weight of what had passed sink in. And now, as the first blush of dawn painted the sky in soft hues of golden rose, J.D. stood alone at the edge of the Capitol steps, the marble cool beneath his boots, the air crisp with the promise of a new day. Behind him, the Grand Dome caught the morning light, a silhouette of strength and history. Before him, the city stretched out, waking slowly, unaware in its small, early stirrings of the storm that had just been weathered within those walls. J.D. watched as the flag atop the Capitol began to rise, the fabric catching the breeze, unfurling against the pale sky. For a moment it seemed to J.D. that the entire nation might be holding its breath, waiting to see what would come next. His thoughts turned inward, the noise of the past weeks giving way to a clarity that only comes in the quiet of dawn. America doesn't belong to shadows, he thought, the words forming as surely as if he'd spoken them aloud. It belongs to builders, to those who lift, who fight, who refuse to look away when it's easier to be silent. Pride stirred in him, not the pride of victory, but of purpose honored. Fatigue layered over it, a heaviness in his limbs, in his heart, that spoke of the cost paid in sleepless nights, in strained friendships, in the distance that duty sometimes demands. Yet beneath it all, there was peace. He had done what he had set out to do. And now, as the flag climbed higher, as the sun rose over the city he had fought to protect, J.D. Vance felt the storm within him quiet at last. The battle had left its mark, but it had also left its lesson. And J.D. knew as he turned from the steps and walked toward the day ahead, that the work of builders never truly ends. The dawn's quiet promise stayed with J.D. Vance as he made his way back to Ohio, back to where the fight had begun, not in speeches or votes, but in the silent hopes of men and women who built America with their hands. The mill stood like a sentinel on the edge of town, its silhouette once a symbol of decline, now alive again with the hum of machinery, the clang of tools, the steady rhythm of work restored. J.D. walked the ground slowly, taking it all in. The scent of oil and steel, the heat rising from the furnaces, the sound of voices shouting orders, sharing jokes, reclaiming what had been theirs. He passed workers who paused to shake his hand, their expressions a mix of gratitude and quiet pride. He offered no speeches, no grand gestures. He was here not to claim credit, but to witness the rebirth they had all fought for. Near the loading dock, a boy stood with his father, wide-eyed at the sight of it all. The scale, the power, the promise of what might one day be his. J.D. crouched beside him, the weight of the journey reflected in his tired but steady gaze. "Your future's worth every fight," he said softly. The words meant as much for himself as for the boy. The child nodded, clutching his father's hand tighter, as if already understanding the truth in J.D.'s voice. As J.D. rose, the morning sun broke fully over the horizon, its light spilling across the mill, across the town, across the flag that flew now, not as a reminder of what had been lost, but as a banner for what had been won. J.D. walked forward, boots on concrete warmed by the new day, his shadow long behind him, his purpose clear. The light bathed the flag, the mill, the man, a nation not perfect, not finished, but reborn through struggle, through sacrifice, through resolve. And with each step, J.D. Vance knew the path ahead would not be easy, but it would always be worth it. This story reminds us that real leadership isn't measured by titles or applause, but by the courage to stand when it's hardest. J.D. Vance's journey reflects the struggle between comfort and conviction, and how one voice, grounded in purpose, can spark change that reaches far beyond one moment. It's a reminder that protecting what matters most, our communities, our jobs, our future, is never easy, but always worth the fight. The resilience of ordinary people and the power of truth spoken at the right time can reshape the path of a nation. What about you? Have you ever felt called to stand up for what's right, even when it wasn't easy? I'd love to hear your thoughts. Share in the comments below. If this story touches you, don't let it stop here. Like, share, and subscribe to JD Stories, where every voice matters and every story echoes far beyond the screen. This story is a fictionalized and dramatized narrative created for educational, inspirational, and storytelling purposes. While it may be inspired by real public events, people, or societal issues, it includes imagined dialogue, reconstructed scenes, and character interpretations meant to highlight broader themes of justice, dignity, and resilience. Any resemblance to actual events or individuals beyond public knowledge is purely coincidental. We do not intend to defame, mislead, or harm, but to invite reflection and meaningful conversation. Thank you for watching JD Stories.